The biggest mistake I used to make with Daikon was not the seed, and it was not the variety either. It was the way I prepared the soil and watered it after planting. I would sow the seeds carefully, water the bed, and then wait for those long white roots I had seen in other gardens, only to pull one up weeks later and find it short, twisted, cracked, or covered with little side roots. I was doing the work, but I was losing the harvest before I even knew there was a problem. If your daikon grows plenty of green leaves but the root underneath never becomes long and smooth, you may be making the same mistake I made for years. The strange part is that the plant can look perfectly healthy above the ground, while the real problem is happening several inches below your feet. Daikon wants room to move straight down, and if it meets hard soil, stones, old roots, or a dry layer, it has no choice but to change direction. That is when you start seeing crooked roots, split roots, or several small roots instead of one good one. Years ago, an older gardener showed me something so simple that I almost laughed when he told me to try it. Before planting, he pushed a plain wooden stick deep into the soil and watched how easily it moved. If the stick stopped against hard ground, he knew the daikon would have trouble long before the seed ever sprouted. I still use that little test today because it costs nothing, and it tells me more than many products sold for root vegetables. But soil is only the beginning, because there is another mistake that can ruin the crop right after planting. I used to think a heavy watering was the best way to help the seeds get started, but I learned that too much water at once can move the seeds, wash fine soil into a hard layer, and leave the surface crusted before the young roots have a chance to settle. Now I water slowly and gently, and I keep the soil evenly moist instead of soaking it and then letting it become dry. That one change saved me more failed rows than I care to remember. And in a moment, I want to show you the simple, old planting method I use now because this is where you can make the biggest difference before the daikon ever begins forming its long white root. I used to think the problem was simply not giving daikon enough water, so whenever the weather turned warm, I would reach for the watering can almost every evening. That seemed sensible at the time because the young plants looked thirsty and I wanted to keep them growing. But after a few seasons, I noticed something that was hard to ignore. The rows that I watered lightly every day often gave me shorter roots and weaker plants, while the rows that received slower and deeper watering stayed stronger and produced much better roots. The mistake was not that I was watering too little. I was watering in the wrong way. Daikon does not need the soil to swing between very wet and very dry, and it does not need a small drink on the surface every few hours. What it needs is steady moisture that reaches down into the soil where the root is actually growing. I learned this the hard way because the surface can look damp while the deeper soil is already drying out. You look at the bed and think everything is fine, but underneath, the root is working in a completely different situation. When the soil repeatedly dries and then suddenly gets soaked, the growing root can become stressed and may crack or develop an uneven shape. I started paying less attention to the surface and more attention to what was happening below it. When I water now, I do it slowly and calmly, and I give the moisture time to move down instead of rushing across the surface. Very few people have the patience for this because it feels easier to walk through the garden every day and give everything a quick splash, but that habit can keep the moisture too close to the top. The old method I was shown was much simpler. Water thoroughly enough to reach the deeper soil, then leave the bed alone until it actually begins to dry instead of following a rigid daily schedule. I also stopped watering during the hottest part of the afternoon. Much of that water disappears before it reaches the root, especially when the soil is warm and the surface is exposed. Early morning is my first choice because the soil is cooler and the moisture has time to settle in. Evening can work too when the heat has gone down. This saves water and keeps the plant growing without those sudden changes that cause trouble. But there is one more part of this method that most gardeners completely overlook, and it can decide whether your daikon stays smooth all the way to harvest. When I first learned to grow daikon properly, I did not learn it from a book or from a bag of fertilizer, and I certainly did not learn it from some expensive garden product. I learned it from an older gardener who had been growing vegetables for many more years than I had. I remember walking past his garden one morning and seeing a row of daikon that looked almost too neat to be real. The green tops were strong and even, and when he pulled one from the soil, the root came out long and clean, with hardly any bending at all. I looked at my own row later that same day, and the difference was obvious. Mine had short roots and strange shapes, and some had split near the bottom. I asked him what he was doing differently, and I expected him to tell me about a special seed or some fertilizer that I had never heard of. Instead, he pointed at the soil and told me that the root can only grow as straight as the ground allows it to grow. That sentence stayed with me, because it changed the way I looked at the whole garden. He did not rush when he planted. He did not walk around with a bottle of something every morning. He simply prepared the soil properly and then paid attention to the moisture. He showed me how he would push a simple wooden stick into the bed before planting, and if it stopped hard a few inches down, he would loosen that area before putting in the seed. He told me that people often work very hard on the surface while forgetting that the crop they want is growing underneath it. That was one of those old lessons that sounds almost too simple when you first hear it, but becomes more valuable every season you use it. He also taught me not to keep the bed soaked just because the seed had been planted. He would water slowly and gently, and then wait and watch the soil instead of following a clock. He said that a good gardener should know when the ground needs water without making the plant suffer from too much attention. I have remembered that advice for years because it saved me both time and money. I stopped buying things to fix problems that began with poor preparation and uneven watering. And there was one final little habit he showed me that I did not understand at first, but later became one of the most useful parts of my daikon routine. Now, let me show you the part that changed my results the most, because this is where the simple method finally comes together. I do not try to force the daikon to grow faster, and I do not keep adding things to the soil, hoping the root will become bigger. Instead, I prepare a straight path for the root, and then I give it steady moisture while leaving it alone as much as possible. Before sowing, I loosen the soil deeper than I used to, not just the surface where my hand can easily reach. I remove stones, hard pieces of old roots, and anything else that could stop the young root as it moves downward. I am not trying to make the whole garden perfect. I am simply making sure the space directly under the seed is open enough for the root to move without meeting resistance. This is one of those old methods that costs nothing, because most of what you need is already in your garden. A stick, a narrow tool, your hands, and a little patience can do more here than another bag of fertilizer. Once the soil is ready, I make a shallow planting line and place the seeds without pressing them deep into compacted ground. I cover them gently and then water slowly so the soil settles around the seeds without washing them into another place. After that, I resist the temptation to keep disturbing the bed. I have learned that digging around young daikon just to see what is happening underneath does more harm than good because the root needs undisturbed soil to develop its shape. Instead, I watch the leaves and I check the soil with my finger. If the surface looks dry but the soil below still feels moist, you wait. If the deeper soil begins to feel dry, then I water properly and let the moisture move down. That is the whole system, and it sounds almost too easy. But there is another small detail that can make a surprising difference. I like to keep a light layer of clean organic material over the soil once the young plants are established. It helps slow down moisture loss and keeps the surface from drying into a hard crust after watering. You do not need an expensive mulch for this. A small amount of dry leaves or other suitable garden material can do the job. And now we are getting close to the point where you can look at the green tops and think everything is going perfectly while something underneath may still be going wrong. That is the mistake I want to help you catch before harvest. One mistake that almost nobody talks about happens when the daikon already looks healthy and the gardener begins to feel confident. I know this feeling because I have made the same mistake myself. You walk through the garden and see strong green leaves standing above the soil and you think the harvest is already guaranteed. But the part that matters most is still hidden underneath. I learned not to judge a daikon only by its leaves because a healthy-looking top does not always mean a good root below. One of the worst things I used to do was give the bed a heavy watering just before harvest because I thought a little extra moisture would make the roots swell faster. Sometimes the opposite happened and I would pull a root a few days later only to find a crack running down the side. All those weeks of careful work could be spoiled by one sudden change in moisture. Now I keep the soil steady right through the final stage and I pay attention to the weather instead of following my usual routine. If several days of rain are coming, I do not add more water simply because it is my normal watering day. The plants do not care about my schedule and neither does the soil. This small change saves water and protects the roots at the same time. There is another mistake that is even easier to make and it has nothing to do with watering. I try not to walk directly over the growing bed once the daikon is established. Every step presses the soil down, and if that soil becomes compacted around the growing roots, it can make their path harder. Years ago, I started keeping narrow paths between my beds, and I stopped stepping into the planting rows unless I absolutely needed to. It costs nothing, and it keeps the soil loose for the roots. Very few people think about this because the damage happens slowly, and you cannot see it from above. As harvest gets closer, I also resist the temptation to pull one root just to check how big it has become. Instead, I look at the part of the shoulder that begins to show above the soil, and I watch how the plant develops. If the weather stays suitable, I give it the extra time it needs rather than forcing the harvest early. That patience often gives me a longer and smoother root without spending another penny. But even after growing the root correctly, there is still one final mistake that can ruin the harvest when you pull it from the ground. By this stage, I have learned to stop trying to make the daikon grow faster, because that is usually when we make the biggest mistakes. Once the leaves are strong and the root is growing below the soil, I simply keep the conditions steady and let the plant do its work. I check the soil with my fingers before watering, and I pay more attention to what is happening a little below the surface than what I see from above. If the soil still has moisture, I leave it alone. If it has started to dry deeper down, I water slowly and give the water time to move into the ground. This sounds almost too simple, but it is one of those old habits that saves both water and money. I do not use a complicated irrigation system, and I do not feel that I need one. If you have an old watering can or a simple hose with a gentle flow, you already have what you need. The important thing is not the equipment. It is the way you use it. I let the water soak in slowly instead of flooding the bed because fast water can run across the surface and leave the deeper soil dry. I also avoid watering during the hottest part of the day because much of that water disappears before the root can use it. Early morning is usually my favorite time, and if I miss that window, I wait until the evening when the heat has gone down. I have found that this steady routine keeps the roots growing without those sudden changes that can lead to cracked or rough daikon. Another thing I learned is to stop walking on the planting bed once the roots are developing. It seems harmless when you take one step between the plants, but repeated footsteps slowly press the soil together and make the underground path harder for the root. I keep simple walking paths between my rows and leave the growing soil alone. That costs nothing, and it protects the work I already put into the bed. As the harvest gets closer, I also stop trying to guess what is happening underground by pulling up a root early. Instead, I gently look at the shoulder where the daikon begins to show above the soil. If it looks healthy and the weather is still suitable, I give it more time. That patience is often the difference between an ordinary root and the long, smooth daikon I was hoping for. But there is still one final moment where even a beautiful root can be damaged, and that happens when we decide it is time to pull it from the ground. By the time I reach harvest, I already know whether I have been patient enough because the garden usually tells me everything if I take the time to look. I gently brush a little soil away from the top of a mature daikon and look at the shoulder of the root. When it is firm and smooth and the plant has had steady moisture without sudden flooding or drying, I know I am getting close. I never pull every root on the same day just because it is convenient, because not every plant grows at exactly the same speed. Some are ready earlier and some need another few days, and if the weather is still suitable, I am happy to wait. That extra patience often gives me a larger and better-shaped root without costing another penny. When I finally decide it is time to harvest, I do not grab the leaves and pull as hard as I can. If the soil is loose and slightly moist, the daikon should usually come out with gentle pressure. If it does not move easily, I stop because forcing it can break the root underground, and after waiting all those weeks, I do not want to lose it at the very last moment. Instead, I loosen the soil around the root with my hands or use a garden fork a little distance away so I do not cut into the daikon itself. It takes another minute, but that minute protects the whole harvest. There is a real satisfaction in lifting a long, clean, white root from the ground and seeing that it stayed straight because you prepared the soil properly and kept the moisture steady. I remember when most of mine were short-cracked or crooked, and I thought I needed better fertilizer or some expensive product. In the end, I needed fewer products and better habits. Give the root loose soil from the beginning. Water deeply and calmly instead of giving the surface a little drink every day. Keep the moisture steady instead of letting the bed become bone dry and then soaking it. Watch the soil instead of following a fixed watering schedule. Keep your feet off the growing bed so the soil stays open and easy for the roots to move through. These are simple habits, but they are the old habits I trust most because they cost almost nothing and they make the work easier rather than harder. And once you learn to grow daikon this way, you start seeing the same lesson in many other vegetables. Good gardening is often not about doing more. It is about removing the mistakes that quietly hold the plant back. The next time you walk into your garden, remember that the most important part of your daikon is hidden below your feet, and the way you treat that soil today will decide what you pull from it later.